and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time certainly talking about a number of issues in the news. A little bit later, we'll cycle back to what we talked about yesterday, the shooting at Annunciation Catholic School. We've learned a lot more about the shooter. Some of that came in when we were doing a book interview yesterday and didn't have a chance to talk about that, so we'll get into that. Also talk about the Federal Reserve and Donald Trump, and we'll talk about why Florida universities became world-class in light of some of this theme we've had over these last couple of days, looking at some of the success stories in the public schools. We'll talk about some of the success stories in universities. We'll get into gerrymandering and a number of other issues. But one of the questions that surfaces from time to time, and I think it's a very good question, given the fact that our former presidents are wealthy individuals, what we used to provide in terms of perks for outgoing presidents maybe doesn't make as much sense. I mean, we don't want somebody who has been serving all those years in Congress or is the president to go to the poorhouse, but that seems to not be the kind of problem that surfaced sometimes in the 19th century. So I thought to talk about that, we'll go to Demian Brady. He is the Vice President of Research for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation, also runs the National Taxpayers Union Budget Office, including certainly looking at some of the various commentaries which we've quoted in the past, who pays taxes, and a variety of others. A graduate of Bowling Green University with a master's degree in political science from American University. Demian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, a lot of people are not aware of all the perks that we provide to former presidents after they leave the White House. So it's an interesting topic.
Well, let me first of all say that, of course, we have a link to ntu.org, but to make it very easy, we have that first link, and it shows the wealth of the individuals, and I'll have you go through that in just a minute, and then just the budget cost. And I think for our listeners up there in the Chicago area, they're well aware of the fact that it seemed to have taken forever, and is still taking forever, for Barack Obama to build his presidential library. I'm one of those geeks that has gone to almost every presidential library in the country at one time or another, so I'm well aware of that. But what we are talking about is something that maybe made some sense in the past. There were individuals that would leave Congress, even leave the presidency, and they really were maybe financially destitute, or certainly not in the same financial circumstance they were before they entered into it, and there were a lot of reasons for that. But I think, first of all, let's, if we can, just talk about how wealthy all of the former presidents are. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, we did searches through media and online resources that track these sorts of things, and found that Bill Clinton has an estimated net worth of $120 million. Barack Obama has a net worth estimated at $70 million. George W. Bush at $40 million. And Joe Biden, who just left the White House, is worth of around $10 million. And he also just signed a $10 million book deal for his memoir.
And I think it's worth mentioning that each one of these individuals, especially Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, wrote more than one book deal. They also, when they would speak, oftentimes would be paid $100,000 for a speech or for an appearance. You, of course, had the Clinton Foundation. You have a number of other things. So nobody is actually looking at a former president and saying, you have some significant needs, so we, as our thank you as American taxpayers, think that we should pay you a great deal more. So once we recognize that they are all multimillionaires, can you begin to help us understand the benefits that come from being a president after he, and someday maybe she, leaves office?
Yeah, certainly. So you had noted how some former presidents were down on their luck financially after leaving the White House, and that's how this law was originally passed back in the late 1950s that provides these perks and benefits. It was argued that Harry Truman was having a hard time and struggling financially, so that we need to protect the dignity of former presidents and provide them a pension and funding for an office, because there are some responsibilities that continue on for a president after their term has expired and they leave the White House. So that was the justification there. But there's a caveat to that, because his widow's papers were made publicly available in the last several years, and it turns out that his wealth at the time was much more considerable than reported. So it could be that this was sold to us on a false pretext. but especially in the modern era, as you noted, the former presidents have so many opportunities to make income in the private sector through book deals. They can get a hefty amount anytime they make a speech. It's time to take a look at some of these perks that provide the office and staff and other things like that, and provide some relief for taxpayers while we are dealing with a $37 trillion federal debt.
Again, the Former President's Act, 1958. Of course, you have the pension, you have a cabinet secretary's office, you have, of course, the retirement income and the rest. But then we certainly can get into, they get personal compensation, they get personnel benefits, they get pension, travel, office space, communications, printing, supplies, equipment. I mean, that adds up to just a few dollars now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's averaged about $5 million a year for the last several years. It's interesting with the office space that they get. There's no cap on that, so there's no cap on the size or where it could be located, and they tend to be located in high rent areas, which is why that is one of the most costly of the perks that are provided. And former presidents also generally tend to locate their office of the former president pretty much in the same place as where they have their foundation. So we need some more transparency there to make sure that taxpayers' money is not being spent on other things.
And again, some of those have turned into a bit of a boondoggle. And I mentioned, of course, Barack Obama will someday see that presidential library, and I hope to visit it. It doesn't seem like it's the kind of place architecturally I'd be that interested in. But nevertheless, because he has been the president for 8 years, would like to see it. So let's take a break. I want to come back.
Well, there is one interesting thing about his presidential library, because that center that he has in Chicago, it's not actually a library. He is not going to store any of his presidential papers there on site. So that actually does save taxpayers money, because all those documents are in a facility owned by the National Archives. Because when a president opens their library and they're hosting their White House government documents, then the government provides some funding for that, for the upkeep of the facility and to make sure it's up to standards for protecting archives. So I've heard some critiques of the architecture of his building, but at least he's saving taxpayers money by not having his documents there.
Well, let's give credit where credit is due. I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about, can we actually reform this? And Senator Johnny Ernst has introduced what's called the Presidential Allowance Modernization Act, and so we'll get into that and some other solutions. And then we'll spend some time just talking about all the good work that is taking place right now at the National Taxpayers Union. As we pointed out, $37 trillion. Don't you think taxpayers need to rethink a lot of things? And that's certainly what they're doing there at ntu.org. You can visit their website right now during the break, or you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on that first article. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a federal judge struck down a government regulation that protected the Little Sisters of the Poor. Once again, they will have to go to court. The case has been going on for more than a decade. When we discussed it recently, one of my guests said that she first heard about it and studied it while in law school. When the Obama administration crafted the Affordable Care Act, they required that employer-sponsored insurance cover the cost of contraception. The nuns asked for an accommodation under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The case was only resolved near the end of the first term of the Trump administration, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the sisters 7-2. That should have been the end of the case, but two attorneys generals in Pennsylvania and New Jersey were joined by other blue state attorneys general who focused one part of the Supreme Court argument. They were eventually able to convince the federal judge to rule against the Little Sisters of the Poor. This story illustrates how far liberals and progressives will go to force people to adopt their social and political views and subordinate their religious convictions. These nuns do not need contraception, which can also include abortifacients, but the persistence of these attorneys general and other Democratic leaders who are forcing this issue should be a warning to what might be coming. They aren't just trying to win the battle of ideas. These politicians have continued to keep this case alive and to attack the nuns who have already been through more than a decade of litigation. In one sense, this case with the Little Sisters of the Poor is a preview of coming attractions. The leaders of these blue states have demonstrated they will demand complete obedience to whatever authoritarian rules they enact once they are in power. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking with Demian Bradley, who is the Vice President of Research for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation and an individual that has written this piece, Why Are We Paying for Presidential Perks? In just a few minutes, I want to get into some of the other issues because we have on this program many times before talked about waste, fraud, and abuse. National Taxpayers Union was involved in those kinds of projects long before there was even the idea of a Doge, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Demian, talk about what we can do. Some people might say, well, this isn't going to change. We're so used to paying our presidents and giving them all sorts of perks and benefits, but there is at least a piece of legislation being considered. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa has introduced the bill you noted, the Presidential Allowance Modernization Act. It would cap the pension that they get. Currently, the pension is tied to the salary that a cabinet secretary gets, which this year is over $250,000. So it would cap that at $200,000 a year, and it would be indexed for inflation going forward. And it would also cap the office expenses available to each former president based on how wealthy they are. So the more wealth they have, the less amount of money taxpayers would provide for that funding. Another thing we could also look at too is putting a cap on the length of time to provide the office benefits.
That's another question. Yeah.
Yeah, because especially when you have somebody like Barack Obama who leaves the White House at a relatively young age, this is a perk that's going to be available for a long period of time. And I imagine a lot of what they do is responding to correspondence, and we could also potentially be funding the process whereby they get their speaking engagements booked. So they make a lot of money off of that. So they ought to be footing the bill for it and provide taxpayers some relief.
Well, and again, we've seen some that have lived a long time. Jimmy Carter is a good example of that. But how much of that has to do with being president? How much has to do with other things that they are pursuing? George W. Bush very much involved in dealing with those in the military and all sorts of different philanthropic activities. It does seem to me that even having a time limit, because establishing your presidential library or a place where people can learn more about you is helpful. But at the same time, I think eventually they do move on and are involved in other kinds of activities that be developed maybe because they were president, but nevertheless are certainly there. And since I'm just down the road from where George W. Bush's presidential library is, I'm well aware of the fact that over time, the library itself develops patrons, supporters. Of course, there were people that supported him even when he was president, when he was the governor, and even before that, the owner of the Texas Rangers. So there is another sense in which these can be self-sustaining. Of course, we've seen the Clinton Foundation and things like that. There are going to be other sources of income. So why have the taxpayers pay for all of it since they almost become self-funding on their own?
Yeah, that's a good point. And there also needs to be better transparency from the government on how much money is going to each of these presidential libraries. It's a pretty large system, and it's expanding potentially every 4 or 8 years. And so, taxpayers need a little bit of more relief in that, and better transparency on what the expenses are. Because we're providing funding to provide to make sure that these facilities are up to par to protect archives. And then we also get involved in funding repairs to various parts of the building and the air conditioning and things like that as well.
And again, I think that is one of the reasons why I wanted people to know about this. One of the things we do, Demian, is do an action alert, and we might a little bit later, if we see some movement on that particular piece of legislation, which has been put forward by Senator Joni Ernst, might even encourage people to write their members of Congress, their senators, about that. But I thought for just a few... Go ahead.
Can I just add one more thing about that bill? That a previous version of it had been passed by the House and the Senate, and Obama vetoed it just 3 months before he was leaving the White House. So there wasn't time to overturn that veto, and he wanted to protect those benefits for himself. So I think if the same thing happened now and Congress got that bill to President Trump, he has many reasons to want to get that into law.
I would think so. He would sign it simply since he hasn't been taking a paycheck anyway and been donating it. I thought for just a minute, though, I did want people to know about the National Taxpayers Union. And one of the other articles you have, which was, again, written to a member of Congress, was about the need to evaluate some of the improper payments, and that these improper payments, in this case having to do with the Transparency Act, could cut down waste, fraud, and abuse. But I thought I'd broaden it and recognize that for many decades now, NTU, National Taxpayers Union, has really been on the forefront of trying to find ways to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. Long before anybody even thought of having a Doge, you've been certainly focused on that. So can you talk a little bit about this concern about waste, fraud, and abuse? Because everybody says they're against it, but when you go and try to cut some of it, it gets to be pretty difficult, doesn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, because when you have a group of people who are getting these funds, they can be pretty vocal in making sure that they get to continue. So it's been very heartening to see the results of what Doge has done so far this year by going through the budget and getting rid of useless contracts and subscriptions to various media services that a lot of agencies had, and closing down some ridiculous waste of money, like the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C., which was one of maybe 4 think tanks in the country that is included as a line item in the federal budget. Something I've been writing about for many years, saying this is one program among many that we ought to be eliminating. So now we need action from Congress to follow up on all this, because they did pass President Trump's tax reform bill. And so now the number one focus has to be on tackling the overspending. And They also need to make sure to codify a lot of the changes that DOGE has implemented to make sure that these programs aren't going to come back, and have Congress conduct proper oversight of agencies and making sure that they're not getting unauthorized funding. There's lots of programs whose authorization has expired many, many years ago, which means that Congress is not doing its proper function in oversight by holding hearings and evaluating whether these programs are meeting a purpose or not, and providing good results for taxpayers. So there's lots of work to do to get the budget under control.
Might just mention again, ntu.org. Matter of fact, one of the articles there is about how the big, beautiful bill brings $3,500 tax break for the average American family, something that I don't think has been emphasized enough. But on the other hand, when we've seen an attempt after that bill to do some rescissions to pull back some of that, there have been a few successes, but I think all you have to do is see what happened to Elon Musk and some of the attacks on Tesla when we were pointing out things that really did need to be taken out of the federal budget. There is an incredible amount of resistance to that, and I appreciate the fact that you and your organization over these years have really stood for taxpayers and pointed to some places where there's been waste, fraud, and abuse, and certainly will continue to support you in doing that, and I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for the kind words that all my colleagues at NTU and NTU Foundation are doing.
Again, let me just mention that we have ntu.org. You can follow that. First article there, well, we might turn it into an action alert a little bit later if we'll see some movement on that. I think that's just sort of an obvious particular action. When we were dealing with people in the 19th century, we do know some that didn't do so well financially. He used the example of Harry Truman, which sounded like a concern until we found out later, well, it wasn't as much of a concern as we thought it was. And any individual that wants to look at this particular article and see the financial resources available to former presidents recognize that they're doing pretty well. And they also have presidential libraries that allow them to do fundraising, and that's probably could bring in all sorts of streams of income, and maybe you shouldn't have to pay for it with your tax dollars. Nevertheless, just before we take a break, while we're talking about funds, one of the things we've encouraged you to do in the past is to consider whether or not you could chip in $10, and that's still something I might mention as we go to a break, because there are some opportunities for you as you hear us talking about some issues that probably aren't covered very often by the legacy press. That's what we like to do here on Point of View. So when we come back, going to get into a couple of other key issues, and as I've pointed out, still got some issues with the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell and tariffs and gerrymandering and a variety of other issues. So go to the website at pointofview.net to find many of the articles we're going to be referring to today, many of the websites that we'll be pointing you to, and we'll take a break and be back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
I have an opportunity now to talk with Kurt Ver Beek, and he is the co-founder of the Association for a More Just Society, individual that has taught sociology at Calvin University. Might just mention, too, that we also have the book Bear Witness, in which he is mentioned there as well. And as a professor, he also directed what was called the Honduras Justice Studies Semester, and as a result, he's also the author of the book Call for Justice, co-written by the Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff. So we bring to Kurt to the conversation, and thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. That was a big introduction.
Unfortunately, we don't have the best line from you in Honduras, but we'll see if we can deal with it for the next minute or two. And Kurt, first of all, I guess it would be good to even talk about this organization. We have asj-us.org. People don't have to remember that, though. We have that link, and we have information about the Association for a More Just Society. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization?
Yeah, sorry about the connection if that's not going so well. I'm calling from Honduras. So our organization was 27 years ago, it's a few years old, and we started as helping out, trying to help poor communities. We did agriculture, health, literacy work. But then after about 10 years of that, we thought that a lot of the issues that were hurting the poor were much more systemic, corruption, violence that the police weren't addressing. And so 27 years ago, we started ASJ, and we have been, trying to get more days for kids in the public school, getting safety in communities, and we've been relatively successful.
Might just mention, too, we've got a picture here of a sign that says No Mas Corruption, or End Corruption Now. And so, again, that is one of those key issues: justice, history, literacy, and the rest. Put in perspective what is going on in Honduras. I was just in a meeting this morning where some of our staff were talking about the outreach they have in Burundi, which we were at the time saying is the poorest country in the world. Turns out, I guess I looked it up, it's second poorest. South Sudan is even poorer. But in terms of poverty, and in terms of the Western Hemisphere, Honduras is certainly on that low end, isn't it?
Yeah, so Honduras is one of the poorest countries in America. Usually it's in the bottom three. And also, I don't think it's disconnected from that. It also has had one of the highest violence rates in the world. And like in 2011, 2012, Honduras had the highest homicide rate in the world, higher than Afghanistan, Iraq, Mexico. And so ASJ and Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, we started investigating why this was. And we ended up figuring out it had almost all to do with drug trafficking, with drugs coming from Colombia, Venezuela through here, and that the police were involved. And so in 2016, we led an effort to clean up the Honduran police force and ended up firing almost half of the Honduran police force, 6,000 out of 13,000 cops. And now the homicide rate in Honduras is about a quarter of what it was then. So a very brave, kind of crazy thing to do for Christians to lead an effort to clean up the police force. But it has been very successful in bringing down violence in Honduras.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. First of all, one of the things we've posted on our website is the book Bear Witness by Ross Halpern, Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. Of course, it tells some of your story. And the book is out, so you can maybe look for it in your local bookstore. But what we've done is made it easy for you to order it in hardcover or Kindle. But it does seem to me, and as an individual that used to teach at a major university, which was Christian, we oftentimes talk about, well, we need to pray for these individuals, or we need to provide food and resources, all of which is true. But one of the things that you have recognized, and this book talks about, and the reason there even is an association for a more just society, is sometimes these problems are systemic. We can pray about it. We can provide food, we can provide education, but if there's corruption, that is a very important issue that Christians need to address as well, don't they?
Yeah, I think a good example little story I tell regularly is there was a local Christian group was helping start small businesses in our neighborhood, and we live in kind of a rough neighborhood. And one of our neighbors started making pillows. She was very successful. She ended up with 2 employees. She was selling a couple hundred pillows a week. And then the gangs showed up and started charging her extortion. And within a few months, she was paying the gangs more than her profit. Like her business was losing money. And she had to shut it down. And I think that's a good example of the issues that we have been addressing now, that it's great to help people start businesses, microenterprise, but they need like a context of safety. They need a good police force that they can trust. So that is really why we started ASJ, to try and address issues like that often not just Christian organizations, secular organizations as well, don't get into these sorts of issues. They feel like they're too complicated, too dangerous. And ASJ said, if we really love our neighbors, we have to address the issues that are most hurting them.
What about the partnerships you've put together? Because it does seem to me that that's another very important issue. Because, Kurt, oftentimes I have people say, what should I do? And I said, well, you got a pronoun problem. What should we do? Because oftentimes there is strength in numbers, there's accountability, there is maybe resolve. And so I know that partnerships are one of the things you talk about there at the Association for a More Just Society.
Yeah, good question. I think early on, we started this out of need. So we were a tiny little organization trying to take on big issues. And we knew that we weren't going to get people's attention by ourselves. So we tried to join up with big partners. So we started working with the Catholic Church, with the Protestant Church, with World Vision, other organizations. And it worked. We got way more attention. And that provided safety for us. It was harder to attack the churches than it was little ASJ. But I think once we figured out that this strategy worked, we just kept doing it. And so now almost all of our work, if it's on corruption or violence or education, we try and it's often the same partners, which is also good because we've developed now trust with the leadership of the Protestant Church in Honduras. About half of the Honduran population is Protestant, about half is Catholic. So if you have those two churches at the table when you're meeting with the president or talking to the press, you'll get lots more attention and you're much more likely to be successful.
I remember that even in our local community, there were oftentimes protests of, say, abortion clinics when abortion was more legal than it is now. And I noticed the way the press changed the way they covered the story when some of the local pastors or some of the seminary professors showed up at some of those situations. And I think you've certainly identified that as well. Well, I want to take a break. And when we come back, first, I want to encourage people, if they have a chance, to go to our website and find the link, or else go to asj-us.org and find out a little bit more, because there's a way in which they can help. They can sign up, find out a number of things of going on. But also, since we've talked about what you've been doing in education, health, and maybe even starting up businesses so people can be self-sufficient, I want to get some thoughts about that as well. And I suspect this is the first time you've heard about the Association for a More Just Society, and also maybe be the first time you've heard of the book Bear Witness, The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. So that's one of the reasons we like to cover these kinds of issues here on Point of View. So we'll come back, get into a couple other issues very quickly, as we're talking today with Kurt Ver Beek, who is in Honduras, and we can probably continue that conversation for a few more minutes with that phone call. But as we go to a break, there's a place where you can sign up. Be the first to know, be the first to act. You can put your name, address, zip code, and some opportunities there to maybe receive prayer updates, general updates. And those of you that are maybe involved in a missions outreach, you might think about whether or not your next mission outreach could be in Honduras, and you could partner with some of the things that are being done right now with the Association for a More Just Society. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about what is happening in that country, how you can be involved strategically both in prayer and even in your own financial results and resources, and maybe even if you wanted to visit that country as well. We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Kurt Ver Beek with us. And again, he is with the Association for a More Just Society. And Kurt, let's, if we can, talk about some of the other issues that are certainly very key. And illiteracy, education, poverty, healthcare, those are issues as well. But you certainly recognize that you can deal with some of those other issues, but you had to first address the issue of corruption. But once you have addressed that, it does seem to me that now there are all sorts of opportunities, as you talk about, to be involved in addition to security and justice into education, health, and even building communities. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, good question too. So I can give you one example of something we did in education. I think one thing we've learned is these things are seldom permanently fixed. So it would be nice if you could fix corruption and then it would be done. But in education, there's about 2 million kids in the Honduran public schools. And we figured out in 2010, 2011, that they were only getting about 100 days of school on average, 110. And they're supposed to get 200. In the U.S., that's about the same. Kids should get about 200 days of school. So they were only getting half as many days, and a lot of that was strikes, corruption, just a mess of a system. So we started a campaign, again, with World Vision, Protestant Church, Catholic Church support, to say kids should get 200 days of school. Average Hondurans, nobody even knew that what was happening, that it was supposed to be 200. They were only getting 110. And over the next 3 years, things changed dramatically. And from 2015 through 2020, all the way up till COVID, kids were averaging over 200 days, about 208 days a year.
Very good.
So you can imagine the results for 2 million kids to get almost double the amount of days of school that they were getting before that, how much more they learned in math and in reading. So like that's the kind of stuff that gets us excited and where we feel like we're really helping the poorest Hondurans that are in the public schools.
One of the things I'll be talking about in one of the commentaries coming up is that we recognize that some particular states have done better educationally than others. And if you go back, you realize those southern states that we identify, first of all, they emphasize phonics and curriculum and things like that. But the other is that these were the first schools to come out of the lockdowns with the pandemic. And so it's just a great illustration, again, that if you don't have kids sitting in seats in school, you're not going to have the kind of educational performance that you're looking for. And so by going from 100 days to 200 days, a very significant change there as well. The other gets into healthcare delivery. Again, in a poor country, many times there's malnutrition, poor nutrition, not good healthcare. And I understand that you do provide some technical support and even accountability so that the government and the various medical services are providing that for the not only the youngest generation, but all Hondurans. True?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, our model is very similar, whether it's security or education or healthcare. We almost always start out like doing research, like figuring out what's broken, why isn't this working, how could we fix it? Then we build an alliance with the churches so that we're stronger voice, and then we put this out in the press, and we go on TV and we go on the radio, just like today, talking about these problems here in Honduras and how they could be fixed. And usually politicians pay attention. So like one of the issues you just mentioned, the Honduran public health care system. So all of the poor people in Honduras go to a public hospital or a public clinic where there's doctors that the government hires. They should have medicines. But in the past, regularly they'll only have half of the medicines that they're supposed to have. So if someone has an infection or a serious illness, they often don't have the medicines, and poor people can't afford to go to the pharmacy and buy them. So we, again, started an investigation, pressure on the government to fix this, and we ended up for about 8 years running having 80 to 90% of the medicines that people were supposed to get in the health care, in the hospitals and in the healthcare centers. and it wasn't even that hard. It just required a change in the way the government was doing things. So I think all of these experiences show us, like, I think what it means to love your neighbor, right? How do we look out for our poorest neighbors around us? And oftentimes we can address these big structural things, and it's not as hard or as complicated as we think.
Well said. One of the things we talked about with you is partnership, and it seems to me that, first of all, if an individual want to partner with you, there is a place where they can click on that button that says be the first to know, be the first to act. But it also seems to me that as you have been able to work partnerships with other churches, Catholic and Protestant, perhaps there's a church or two, maybe a pastor, a missions pastor that's listening right now that might be thinking about partnering with you in the churches down there in Honduras. Are you available for that kind of conversation? And what would that look like if indeed individuals wanted to set up a missions trip, if they wanted to maybe partner with you in some way? How would that look? And what can we make available to some of our listeners today?
Yeah, I think even before the break, you outlined almost all of those things we do. So we have regularly groups come down to see our work, but also just to see Honduras and learn more, understand what's going on there and how they can be a part of making things better. We have church partnerships, so we have churches around the U.S. that are supporting us in prayer. We have regular, every month we send out a list of prayer issues that people can be praying over, and how the next month, like what has happened on those issues. So all of those are options. I think, they can go to their website, they can send us an email, and we'd be happy to figure out what works for that church. We're actually having a group coming down. I'll pitch it. Honduras is having elections on November 30. Mm-hmm. It's Thanksgiving weekend, so that's not so attractive to people, but people are coming down on Friday, so on Black Friday, and coming from the weekend to be election observers. We're worried about the government, people in power, carrying out some shenanigans to try and steal the election. So we think international observers are going to be key to try and make sure that we have fair and transparent elections.
Very good. Let me mention again that book Bear Witness is on the website there as well, and it's, again, telling that story. And if nothing else, let's just encourage people to come down when they can. And Kurt, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you and your listeners.
Let's, if I can, take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the things that we've learned about that shooting up there at Annunciation Catholic Church there in Minneapolis. We'll get into then the Federal Reserve. That's kind of an issue in the news. The tariffs, that's an issue in the news. As we've been talking about with going back to school, we've talked about some of the best practices that seem to be working in some of these schools, and we'll now apply that to why is it that many of these universities in the state of Florida have become world-class. Get into gerrymandering and a number of other issues. Quite a bit to cover if we don't get all of it done today. Don't forget that we have our Friday weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews, Penedexter, will be with us, and we look forward to that opportunity as well. If you'd like to know more about either of the guests that we've had the first hour, simply go to the website pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again, have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's, if we can, get back to something I started the program with yesterday by talking about that shooting that took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Annunciation Catholic School. Now, at the time, we didn't know as much as we found out later in the day, but at that point, I was doing an interview on a very good book, which I would highly recommend, What Gen Z Really Wants to Know About God. And so that was a great interview, but there wasn't really a chance to break in to talk about the fact that we've learned a little bit more. What have we learned? We'll probably cover much more of that tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. But the man that carried this out was originally named Robert Paul Westman. But at the age of 17, he and his mother applied to legally change his name to Robin M. Westman, and also to change his gender identity, which, of course, then gets you into the whole issue of transgender. This has some similarity to what happened in Nashville and in other places where he actually attended the school. As a matter of fact, his mother actually had a job there at the church and even donated to the scholarship fund. So in some respects, there is a lot of similarity, but there are a few things that we can talk about. First of all, it was sort of amazing to me how the legacy press was just falling all over itself to try to make sure that if it used a pronoun, it used the preferred pronouns. One of the pieces I've put forward for tomorrow from Jim Garrity, I love what he says, using preferred pronouns on an individual, that privilege gets rescinded when you murder an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old in cold blood. And again, he says, what are we worried about? Offending a now dead gunman? And again, points out that if you look at the number of times these press reports either did where they used gender-neutral terms like the shooter or the perpetrator, even instead of the gunman. So you can see that. But then some other people, Noah Rothman's pointed out, we have had a philosophy, and we use it here at Point of View, where we don't mention the name. I only did to make the point, but we have not mentioned the name because there's pretty good evidence that some of these individuals that do engage in mass shootings do that for the recognition they will receive. And so there has been a real attempt in many cases to avoid naming the names, and that went out the window when this individual turned out to be in the transgender world, and we heard time and time again the name Robin. So that's something to think about. But maybe the most disturbing, and we've seen this over the years when we've had terrorist attacks, and we saw it yesterday with the New York Times. Again, I give you quotes from the New York Times. I oftentimes post articles from the New York Times, but the writers there really need to think through what they're doing, because so often when this comes out, their favorite line is the motive of this particular shooter, or in this case, perpetrator, they don't even sometimes use the word gunman, is a mystery. And as I've said before, it's not a mystery. What was his motive? To kill people in the Catholic Church. And I think that's a pretty obvious motive. We've also talked about the fact that he graduated from elementary school there. His mother worked there. He is really upset about this kind of education maybe that he received, and how now if he is going through a transition, and we'll find out more about that later, it's really not a mystery, especially especially when we look at the gun. And it was only late in the day that I found out all the things that were written on the gun, including things like Israel must fall, kill the Jews. Of course, kill Donald Trump was on the gun stock. Where is your God was one of those. There are two that I can't even refer to because they use swear words, but you kind of get the idea. So, of course, the other thing I thought I would mention just real quickly is that whenever this happens, what a horrific tragedy. And I've heard some individuals saying, I've got a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old. It'll soon be an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, or I've got grandchildren that are that age. I do as well. And you can imagine the horror that you would feel and experience, and it would change your life forever, of losing those individuals. The first thing you would simply say is, well, my thoughts go to those of you that are struggling with that, and I certainly want to pray for comfort. And yet, how many times yesterday did we see, and I'm not just talking about the mayor of Minneapolis, but I'm talking about some of the talking heads saying, I've headed with this idea of thoughts and prayers. And I almost seem to be an attack on, we've already, first of all, attacked a Christian school. We've attacked kids actually in a Catholic situation. And then we attack the people that make some of those statements. But the argument is always made, forget your thoughts and prayers. Let's implement more gun control. And, of course, that's the reflexive reaction. But let's, if we can, at least be honest enough to say that in the state of Minnesota, you probably have more gun control laws than many other places around the country. And so, yes, maybe you could make the case if there is a shooting in Texas, which we had a while back near the border, that was maybe allowed because we have a much easier time to obtain guns. But when the shootings take place in New York, they take place in Minnesota, they take place in Illinois, they take place in California, you already have very restrictive gun laws. This is an individual that, as far as we can tell, there's no evidence to the contrary, that he acted alone, had no criminal history. He's 23 years of age. If you have to be 21 to buy a handgun, which he had, or 18 years old to buy a rifle or shotgun, which he had, then he could purchase them legally. The question, of course, is, were those available to him when his, now her, mother, whatever pronoun you want to use, began to manifest some of these problems, which were evident on his social media. And more importantly, Minnesota is one of those few states that have what are called red flag laws. Those went into effect over a year ago, January 1st, 2024. But again, no one felt the need to file a petition against him for extreme risk protection. So we can go through some more of that maybe tomorrow, but then some of the questions are, how did the media cover it? If indeed you think we need more gun control, what might that be, given the fact that this took place in a state with very restrictive gun control laws, including red flag laws, and a variety of other issues? So even though we didn't cover as much of it yesterday, I did want to mention it again today. Maybe we can get into a little more of the detail tomorrow, but that is certainly an issue that will be front and center for some time, and should be. We should never, whether it's a shooting in Chicago or whether it's now the lack of any kind of murders in Washington, D.C., ever become so commonplace that we never really want to cover them, and we do need to cover those, and we did and mentioned them yesterday. But there were other issues which we didn't get into, and I wanted to try to rectify that by covering that briefly in our first segment in the second hour. But let's get back to some of the issues we've posted for you to consider, and we'll come back after the news to get into those very quickly.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, a federal judge struck down a government regulation that protected the Little Sisters of the Poor. Once again, they will have to go to court. The case has been going on for more than a decade. When we discussed it recently, one of my guests said that she first heard about it and studied it while in law school. When the Obama administration crafted the Affordable Care Act, they required that employer-sponsored insurance cover the cost of contraception. The nuns asked for an accommodation under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The case was only resolved near the end of the first term of the Trump administration when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the sisters 7-2. That should have been the end of the case, but two attorneys generals in Pennsylvania and New Jersey were joined by other blue state attorneys general who focused one part of the Supreme Court argument. They were eventually able to convince the federal judge to rule against the Little Sisters of the Poor. This story illustrates how far liberals and progressives will go to force people to adopt their social and political views and subordinate their religious convictions. These nuns do not need contraception, which can also include abortifacients, but the persistence of these attorneys general and other Democratic leaders who are forcing this issue should be a warning to what might be coming. They aren't just trying to win the battle of ideas. These politicians have continued to keep this case alive and to attack the nuns who have already been through more than a decade of litigation. In one sense, this case with the Little Sisters of the Poor is a preview of coming attractions. The leaders of these blue states have demonstrated they will demand complete obedience to whatever authoritarian rules they enact once they are in power. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you happen to be listening to the program yesterday, we talked a little bit about the origin of the Federal Reserve, talked about some of the back and forth on the Federal Reserve between the chairman, Jerome Powell, and, of course, Donald Trump. But I thought we would come back to it in a different way by posting this piece by Peter Navarro. Now, first of all, Peter Navarro serves right now for the president as an individual that is in the Office of Trade and Manufacturing. He, in the past, served under Donald Trump in the Office of Trade and Manufacturing in the National Trade Council. If you're not familiar with him, he served as a professor at the University of California at Irvine. Certainly brings a lot to the table, but also was convicted of contempt of Congress and became the first person to actually go to jail over contempt of Congress. There have been many other individuals that have been found guilty of contempt of Congress, and they never actually spent any time behind bars. But I do that to help you understand who we're talking about. He obviously is in the Trump administration. He obviously has a bias, but just because he doesn't mean we shouldn't hear those voices along with many of the others that may be critical of the administration. And the point he's making is simply this. Last week, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as they do every time this year, and admitted a couple of things in his speech. And one of those is that the tariffs were not fueling inflation. I've been trying to help you understand that this whole question about tariffs is more complicated. And one of the things I would highly recommend, if you'd like to go to school on that, is go to my commentary, which was yesterday. That's the August 27th commentary on paying tariffs, because I really wanted you to understand understand it's much more complicated than you'd be led to believe by listening to some of the legacy press or even individuals that try to explain it briefly but don't go into the details. So you can do a little bit of a research there. But nevertheless, Peter Navarro, I think, took as at least a success that finally, begrudgingly, the Federal Reserve Chairman had to admit that, maybe tariffs aren't as bad as everybody was saying they were going to be. At most, he says, tariffs create a one-time adjustment in prices, not the kind of runaway spiral that demands punishing rate hikes. And even that one-time bump may be negligible if, as we've argued, foreign exporters, not American consumers, shoulder most of the burden. As a matter of fact, we've got some pretty evidence that that is the case. The implication, he says, is clear. Whether the impact is zero or merely a one-time step-up in prices, there's absolutely no justification for the Federal Reserve to hide behind this, well, there's some uncertainty about tariffs, so that gives us a reason for not to reduce the interest rates, excuse me. He says, really, this is historic epiphany from the Fed chair, who is long misunderstood, he says, Trumponomics, than the four beautiful horsemen of economic growth and price stability. That would be tax cuts, deregulation, strategic energy dominance, and fair trade. And he believes that indeed that has been the case. And after the speech given by the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, the Dow Jones smashed through its 45,000 ceiling. So that was good. And I think a suggestion that come September, which is just around the corner, just remember, Labor Day is Monday. And indeed, there is going to most likely be a rate cut. And many people are now arguing it shouldn't be 25 basis points. It needs to be a lot more. What, again, Peter Navarro says his memo to Jerome Powell, every one of America's major trading partners, the same countries driving our $1 trillion annual trade deficit, is deeply dependent upon access to the U.S. market. When Trump slaps on tariffs, it is the exporters, not the consumers, who shoulder the burden. Without U.S. demand, the economies falter. So pay the tariff piper, our trading partners must. And so he goes on to begin to remind us of the question about the interest rates. He says American families are already being crushed by the world's highest mortgage rates. Small businesses can't afford credit, and exporters face a dollar so overvalued that prices them out of the global markets. As a result, he points out that we live in a world now, this might be news to a lot of you, that the U.S. economy combines the world's highest policy rates and mortgage rates with the world's strongest currency, which is a triple hit to those of us in America that want to export our products overseas. So again, he says that small businesses reliant on bank credit rather than Wall Street bond markets face double-digit loan rates that suffocate job creation. Consumers pay more on everything from credit cards to auto loans. And so he points out that even a token 25 basis points, which would be 0.25%, cut in September is not enough. He's, of course, making the argument that, number one, tariffs aren't as bad as you kept telling us, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. And number two, you've got to cut the interest rates more, not 25 basis points, not 50 basis points. He says 100 basis points. In other words, a full % of interest, and that would make a real difference in terms of people wanting to buy homes, make a real difference in our ability to sell American goods overseas, and certainly be a benefit to small business. So you can see why there's a push back and forth between the Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and, of course, Donald Trump. Tomorrow we have Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and he has strong comments to say about whether or not the president can remove one of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. As I pointed out, I don't think it's going to stand any constitutional muster, but we'll hear from Dr. Merrill Matthews tomorrow on that regard. But just before we take a break, let me just mention my commentary today is about the Little Sisters of the Poor. And that, I think, illustrates again why we should be concerned even in these upcoming elections, because the Little Sisters of the Poor have been in court for year after year after year, and it looks like they're going to have to go back to the court again. Now, to give you some of the history, we'll go back to when the Obama administration crafted what was called the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes called Obamacare. And that required that employer-sponsored insurance needed to cover a number of things and the cost of contraception. By the way, especially when we had abortion illegal, that also meant that many of these contraceptives were abortifacients. Well, you can imagine why the Little Sisters of the Poor, nuns, were not really interested in contraception. They didn't need it. Second of all, it would certainly violate their religious convictions. So they sought an accommodation under what was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, it lingered in the court. It was never completely resolved. There was a resolution of Hobby Lobby, but that was not necessarily applicable to the Little Sisters of the Poor. So when Donald Trump came into office eventually, they were able to put together an accommodation, and that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Little Sisters of the Poor 7-2. That'd be the end of it, you would think. And you would be wrong, because it turns out that two of those states and these attorneys general, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, actually wanted to go back and find another justification, and they were able to find at least one federal judge that agreed that indeed the way in which this particular accommodation was crafted by the Trump administration was not going to stand constitutional muster. So once again, the Little Sisters of the Poor have to go back to court. I suspect eventually it will go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will rule in their favor. But I think it illustrates something that we need to understand, and that is the real demand that came from these attorneys general in these two states, and from others, by the way. There were a number of other states that wanted to join in later on, that even on something as simple as whether or not to force the Little Sisters of the Poor to have in their health care policy contraception, they wouldn't give up, and they would bring this case again. And these are the individuals that you get to vote for or vote against in the next election. These are the individuals that are convinced that once we have passed an edict, there is no deviation, even for any kind of religious accommodation. You've heard us talk about that before here on Point of View, and I think this case of the Little Sisters of the Poor illustrates that particular progressive mindset is not going to give up, even when it involves the Little Sisters of the Poor. I think it's a lesson to be learned, and certainly we would encourage you to read the commentary and learn from that for this next election. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is, of course, time to get back to school. And just the other day, we talked about the Southern Surge, in which you had 4 different states where they've actually improved dramatically in terms of the public school system. And there are some very good reasons for that. And I thought we might talk about universities for just a minute, because there's this very good piece by Christopher Mullen, who actually has served in the state of Florida, in which he points out that Florida universities have become world class. The Sunshine State universities are in the top tier of the Washington Monthly's rankings, thanks to strong public governance and some things that have been taking place even before and then during the fact that Ron DeSantis has been governor. He points out, for example, that Florida is a national leader in higher education with universities that focus on success. He says Florida is known for a number of things: theme parks, retirement communities, but academic excellence is typically not one of those. But if you think about it, the state doesn't have any prestigious Ivy League-like schools, but as he points out, numbers don't lie. The Washington Monthly's 2025 best colleges for your tuition and tax dollars, 7 universities in Florida rank on the top 100, and they include, of course, the state universities that you're very familiar with: Florida International University as well, University of Central Florida, New College, and on and on. And we've mentioned in the past, just last week, we got talking about former Senator Ben Sasse, who left the Senate to become a president in Florida. He's not there now, but you have some really pretty good universities. And so he asks, and then answers a pretty good question, and that is, well, why are these universities where they are? He says, well, part of that is Florida is a populous state with a lot of universities, but then he points out, hey, Michigan and Pennsylvania have about the same combined population as Florida, yet only 2 Pennsylvania colleges, both private, make the top 100 list. None of these colleges in Michigan make the list. And so part of it has to do with the way in which they govern public higher education, and so that is certainly a key element of that. He also says that some of the other states could learn from what they're doing in Florida, trying to be debt-free and really focusing on some of the essentials of education. And he points out that the tradition of a strong state control of institutions in Florida goes back more than a century, because even though there is, I think, a tendency sometimes to say, well, a lot of that has to do with the governor, and I'm sure Governor Ron DeSantis is going to take some credit. Some of that happened before, and there are all sorts of other things. Even as we talk about universities, you know that many times I've talked about the fact that a lot of young people don't need to go to 4-year colleges. And they have in Florida the 2+2 system, which I think is very good, in which students that think they may go on to a 4-year college can go to a lower cost Florida Community College for 2 years and then transfer to a bachelor's degree granting institution without losing credits. Or if they, after that point in time, figure that was all that they needed, can go on. That, I think, is a very wise system. And the other is cost control. This was a great illustration in this article. By the way, it's 6 pages. I'm not even going to try to cover all of it, but I'm just giving you a few highlights to illustrate that if you're in a particular state where you say, I'd like to improve public education, well, I've got a commentary coming out on that. We talked about it the other day in terms of some of the success of the Southern strategy. If you're in a college system, or maybe you're one of the individuals thinking about what you can do to improve the university system in your state, you can learn from that. But here's something else. Because they have a centralized system in which they designate certain colleges to do this, other colleges do something else, it was interesting when several state universities in Florida asked for permission to open law schools, a costly but prestige-enhancing undertaking. The Board of Regents in the state of Florida said no, because based on a study showing that the state's need for attorneys was being met by the existing Florida law schools, lawyers trained in other states were moving to Florida and passing the state bar exam. There was no need for any more law schools, so they actually shut down what would have been prestigious, but it really, if you think about it, was unnecessary. The board also cracked down on the practice of university-required students to take more courses than necessary for their degree by putting a maximum number of credits that would provide state support for in an academic program. Again, carrot and stick and all sorts of other great illustrations. One last one I thought I'd mention. In other states, universities use the so-called merit aid to lure students from affluent families who can pay higher overall tuition, but thus what they do is deprive students from poorer families of the financial aid that they really need. So in 1997, the Florida legislature created a merit aid program funded by lottery revenues that was specifically targeted to high-achieving students. And over the years, then, they've been able to help students that had the greatest need. This goes on for many pages. I won't go into the rest of the details, but simply say that we are learning once again, whether it's in the public schools or in this case universities, best practices. And if you want your universities in your state to do better, maybe you could learn some lessons, at least vicariously, from some of the success there in the state of Florida. So I post that for those of you that may be in the academic world. And more recently, as I've traveled around, I've had a chance to meet some people that serve on the board of regents or in the board of various colleges, universities. I hope that you'll take advantage of that resource and begin to apply it to your state to make a difference. Just before I take a break, we have talked about the problems with gerrymandering, but Edward Ring points out that gerrymandering in some cases might at least prevent the majority party from taking over. Of course, we've seen in places like on the East Coast, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, a number of others where you are actually seeing no Republican representatives. But he says the argument against gerrymandering usually begins with visuals. And you've seen me post some of those maps because we see a map of state or federal electoral districts. They're convoluted. They look like a salamander, hence the name gerrymander. And they have no regard for geographical features or municipal boundaries. But he says there is a problem with that, and that is the more we come up with electoral districts that are logical in shape instead of those which are gerrymandered, the more undemocratic some of the representation might be. And he uses California and Texas as an example. For example, in California, Trump got 38% of the 2024 vote. Republicans only control 15%. In Texas, Trump got 56% of the vote. Republicans control 68% of the vote. Even if you begin to add in the fact that, and this is still up for some grabs, whether Republicans win 5 more seats, it's still within that range. But if every district in a state were a winner-take-all, and if the majority in the state were Democrats, then a Democratic candidate would always win. And so he points out, if you look at some of the maps, that is the case. In California, when viewing party control by county, a pattern emerges that is familiar to most states, especially blue states. The urban centers are deep blue. The rest of the state is a sea of red. But it turns out that the sea of red is a lower population. So sometimes gerrymandering throws a wrench into what is inevitable, but nevertheless, he points out that if indeed Governor Gavin Newsom really wants to manipulate what would take place, you have Trump actually has carried 4 California counties which Democrats currently control, and 3 of them are demographic heavyweights, Orange County, Riverside County, and San Bernardino County. And so he makes the case that when we try to draw these districts I will be the first to admit that some of them look pretty bizarre. But at the same time, if we want to include or interject any kind of fairness, if we didn't have some of the gerrymandering, we would have many of the states where nobody from the opposition party would even have a chance of winning. So we will continue to look at this, but it was probably the most interesting discussion about how sometimes gerrymandering makes some sense if we want to inject any kind of fairness in the next election. But we'll see where that takes us in the future. We come back, though, real quickly, just a quick comment or two that comes down from an individual who has been suggesting how Democratic leaders might respond to some of the various proposals by Donald Trump. And, of course, we'll also encourage you to join us tomorrow because we're going to spend some time with, again, Dr. Merrill Matthews and Penna Dexter getting into some of those issues, ranging from, of course, this tragic shooting that took place in the Annunciation Catholic School in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to a number of very good articles that Dr. Matthews has published in The Hill, and we look forward to that conversation tomorrow. But join us right after the break for at least one more commentary. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that our last article here, which is written by Dean Kerby Anderson, Democrats struggling on Trump's response to crime have forgotten how to say yes and. And this is a lesson that you can learn, even if some of the Democratic leaders have not figured this out. It's just basic common sense. And I always get a smile on my face when I think about this, because Dean Kerby Anderson, if you're not familiar, actually worked with Rush Limbaugh. So he's actually just providing some common sense ways to address the issue. And if Democrats don't listen, well, that's their problem. But it's a way to think about how you may respond if somebody asks you a question. I know sometimes that they even do candidate forums where they help individuals running for office to know how to answer questions. And one of the keys sometimes is to not always accept the premise of the reporter, especially if you're a Republican. The reporter's probably going to be liberal, a Democrat from Legacy Press, and they're going to make some statements, say, well, first of all, I don't agree with the premise of your argument, and then take that on. But there are times when you can say, yes, it's got a good point, but let me add to that. And that's really what he's arguing about, that somehow the leadership in the Democratic Party have forgotten to know how to say yes and. And here's what he's talking about. He says, with President Trump now mulling over whether or not he'll have troop deployments in other American cities, how have the Democrats responded? Well, they've responded with denials that crime is a problem. And he says this is a reflexive opposition that amounts to a weak posture. Voters tend to be more favorable to politicians who imply the improv rule, respond yes and then to advance a topic. Never reject a premise with a no. Now, there are some times when you might, but let's use some examples. The first one he uses is the mayor of Chicago. And if you have seen this video, and it's certainly gone viral, in which the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, struggled to even articulate what his policy as a Democrat and what the Democratic Party's policy would be in Chicago. And on Tuesday on MSNBC, the host of Morning Joe, which is Joe Scarborough, asked if Chicago streets would be safer if there were more uniformed police officers or if there was more federal funding to help put 5,000 cops on duty. If you have ever watched this, and I'm sure it's going to show up again on Bill Maher and a variety of other things, it certainly showed up on Fox News, and that is on 5 separate occasions, Joe Scarborough pressed Brandon Johnson and was met with 5 denials. As again, one of the things that Dean Kerby Anderson is saying is it would have been a great opportunity to say yes, and Chicago would welcome more federal dollars. Or he could have pivoted to arguing that Mr. Trump isn't sending police officers because, say, the National Guard aren't really instructed or equipped for law enforcement. Those are some ways to answer the question. And somehow it just didn't seem to ever occur to the mayor of Chicago. Okay, let's take another one. We have a Democrat from Maryland. That's Jamie Raskin, again, Democrat from Maryland, who was on CNN and many times actually probably took a bad problem and made it worse by simply saying crime has always been part of our history, which was sort of a rhetorical shrug with the problem. And if you're not familiar, one of the questions being raised is, will Donald Trump deploy troops to Chicago? Will Donald Trump deploy troops to Baltimore? And to say either we don't have a crime problem, which is the way in which the governor sort of responded, or, well, crime's always been our problem. Not a good answer and not a good look if indeed you want to win re-election. Let's take another one. Sunday on Meet the Press, Illinois Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker focused on trends. And again, although Chicago had more murders last year than in the UK, J.B. Pritzker said it's actually operating extraordinarily well and in a much better position from a crime perspective than it was 4 years ago. Well, if the murder rate is going down, great. That's not the best answer. And there you are, once again, not learning how to maybe learn the issue, as Dean Cariana says. Say yes and then do what you can. Well, he goes on to point out that Democratic mayors in Los Angeles, Oakland, New York City, Baltimore have all carried the party line that crime is falling, and yet there's a reason for the old journalistic statement, if it bleeds, it leads. So the bottom line is that's what leads on the local newscast, and to then say, well, crime isn't as bad, is not helpful. A single murder or child abduction can strike fear into a city, and citizens just aren't really comforted by those kind of statistics. And so, again, you can see that it also opens you up for a rebuttal from Donald Trump. Because the other day, Donald Trump, he talked about how Mr. Johnson was a very incompetent mayor. He refuted his assertion that the National Guard only arrested 9 people in Washington, D.C., putting the number well over 1,000. Donald Trump talked about the fact that the National Guard took hundreds of guns away from young kids and apprehended scores of illegal aliens along with dozens of illegal firearms. That's how to make the case. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, he's figured out how to make the case. Unfortunately, the mayor of Chicago has not. And the point I'm making is you can learn a lesson vicariously. Sometimes we look at this and we roll our eyes by some of the things that are said by both Republicans and Democrats, by politicians, by people in the media. Well, if you're a wise and discerning individual, maybe you can learn some lessons vicariously from some of the mistakes they've made. But just before we wind down, again, Dean Carianis points out the fact that if you look at any of the polls, and he quotes just one, but there's some others we can look at, but let's look at the one from The Economist YouGov poll. It's certainly, if it's biased at all, it's biased left to center, and yet they found that 67%, or 2/3 of American adults, judged urban crime a major problem. Just 3% said it was not one. So again, 67% versus 3%. That's an illustration, again, maybe you're trying to defend something that in the minds of most Americans is indefensible. And then, interestingly enough, you had 55% that actually believed that crime had increased since 2020, which was the final year of Donald Trump's term. So he ends, again, Dean Carianis, by saying, it's said that perception is reality in politics. Rather than denying Donald Trump's concern about law and order, Democrats would be better off advocating for solutions other than federal troops. Yes, they can say crime is a problem and then pledge to work with him to address it in the cities they serve. It's a lesson to all of us. Yes, and is sometimes a very good answer. Agree with the premise if it is accurate, and then go on to point out that that maybe is an inadequate solution, or there are other solutions that did not get mentioned. Just a lesson in how to craft your message. We're going to have to know how to do that, and the more effective we are, the more effective I think we'll be. That's all we have for today. I hope that we will be able to cover a couple of other very important issues tomorrow on our weekend edition. First of all, go to our website, pointofview.net. You can find out a little bit more about some of the books and resources that we've mentioned here today, some of the organizations you may want to know more about, all available at the website, pointofview.net. Megan, thank you for your engineering of the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program, and we encourage you to visit the website often. Find some of that material, pass it on to your friends, and use it effectively. And most importantly, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, Just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again, have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.